It's no secret that Canada struggles to ever escape from the gravitational pull of the nation to its south, but recent changes made by the US government, which were followed up by similar sets of changes coming from Canada, are making citizens of both countries a little bit worried, because these changes not only have the possibility to impact North American jobs and how much people get paid, but also could negatively impact the cost of living for everybody involved. Certainly unwelcome news for two nations already in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Now, the government, of course, argues that these changes are in the best interests of the people that they serve, but a lot of people are skeptical because these new rules also benefit, well, some of the biggest corporations in North America. So let's take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how the embers for an international economic war have been ignited and how all this could impact you. It probably goes without saying that China manufactures a whole heck of a lot of stuff for people in the West, but you might not know exactly how much this has grown. You can see the red line here showing just how quickly China has rose up the ranks of manufacturers worldwide. So much so that we've seen other nations decline here, and now we've even seen China pass the other top 10 other countries in the world. China dwarfs them combined. But it wasn't always like this. Like, you saw that chart and you can see that America used to be the superpower when it came to manufacturing. But that changed pretty quickly. And despite a hesitancy due to geopolitical and human rights concerns, many people point to this speech I'm about to show you from Bill Clinton in March of 2000 as being the point that sort of kicked off Western economic links to China, as he makes the case for them joining the World Trade Organization, which they would do soon after this speech within the year.
I believe the choice between economic rights and human rights, between economic security and national security, is a false one. Membership in the WTO, of course, will not create a free society in China overnight, or guarantee that China will play by global rules. But over time, I believe it will move China faster and further in the right direction. By lowering the barriers that protect state-owned industries, China is speeding a process that is removing government from vast areas of people's lives.
And there were admittedly a lot of benefits to taking this action. The West really did reap the benefits of the cheap labor via cheap prices, low inflation, goods got cheaper in many different categories, and largely we started to grow a dependency on these lower prices that were afforded to us by importing goods made with cheaper labor. And governments may act like they weren't really aware of the benefits that we were reaping off the backs of all of this cheap labor, but the Bank of Canada certainly did, and I imagine this paper was presented to the government back then. This was written in 2008. The paper is titled Globalization and Inflation, the Role of China, largely making the point that the globalization, the impact of that globalization would result in inflation tending to be lower over the decade, and we saw that. The paper concluded that overall stronger negative effects coming from China to domestic CPI inflation are associated with higher levels of bilateral trade flows. To put that in simple terms, by allowing more and more globalization, products and goods that we import will get cheaper and cheaper because we're not going to have to pay the high wages that manufacturing nationally would make us pay. But alongside the benefits of cheaper prices, some experts are pointing out that there are downsides that we're going to feel in Canada and in the US. Some major impacts resulting from the offshoring of manufacturing from Canada and the US to China. Now, while we benefited from the lower prices on consumer goods, we definitely did, we also at the same time hollowed out North American manufacturing and all the jobs that came along with it. It's this very same narrative that a lot of people mocked worldwide when it was presented by former US President Donald Trump and his campaign manager and advisor, Steve Bannon. This was something that they kept on saying between 2015 and 2020. Check out this clip.
Managed decline by our elites was basically giving China everything they wanted. It was the working class that suffered. All the factories and jobs went from the Midwest. The opioid crisis, J.D. Vance,
I know,
the guy from
Hillbilly Elegy.
Hillbilly Elegy is the best social. And he tells you it's the opioid crisis that took the place when the jobs and the factories left. Tariffs are not about taxes on goods. They're about self-worth and self-determination. These factory workers, we need to bring those manufacturing jobs back.
That's why this is an economic war. But you said something to me, Kyle, years ago that it stuck with me, and I'll never forget this, and I've used your line, by the way, which is there's never been a country in the history of the world that pays high wages to make low-value goods. Does the United States consumer need to pay more? It sounds, are we addicted to cheap? But what I mean by that is we want to go to Walmart, I'm not picking on Walmart, we want to go to a big box store and pay nothing for the goods, the plastics, the textiles that we buy, which means we can't pay anybody a wage or we have to make it overseas.
But now things are really starting to get flipped on their heads. Governments who previously denied this kind of Western protectionism narrative are really changing their stance. We can look at the words of Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau. This past week, he announced a sweeping set of tariffs that would be applied to Chinese manufactured electric vehicles, additional markups that would have to be applied to any vehicles that are imported from China. And his deputy prime minister and finance minister followed up with some also pretty aggressive accusations against China.
I think we all know that China is not playing by the same rules as other countries. Whether it's on environmental standards, whether it's on labor standards and labor practices in general, whether it's on government subsidies and state-owned industries, the group of democracies of which we are a part that value the work that our citizens do, that recognize the need to protect the environment and invest for the longer term, requires us to take action. And what is important about this is we're doing it in alignment and in parallel with other economies around the world that recognize that this is a challenge that we are all facing, that unless we want to get in a race to the bottom, we have to stand up.
The reality is China has an intentional state-directed policy of overcapacity and oversupply designed to cripple our own industries. Talk to the steel sector, talk to the aluminum sector to understand how effective that has already been. And we simply will not allow that to happen to our EV sector, which is showing such promise and in which we have invested so effectively.
Now, the points that Prime Minister Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland are making largely line up with what President Joe Biden was saying back in May of 2024, just a number of months ago. They additionally talk about forced technology transfers and intellectual property theft, but they land on the same points that these non-market policies and practices are contributing to China's overcapacity and export surges that are threatening American workers, businesses, and communities. I think it's just wild to see these policies and narratives that many argue are the policies and narratives that helped Trump win his election in 2016. These very same policies that were mocked are now being welcomed and championed by governments who would have hesitated to make such claims just a few years ago. And whenever you see an about face like this and multiple governments sort of moving in lockstep, it kind of makes you wonder why. Is it like a sudden realization and actually a true change in opinion in an effort to actually act in a citizen's best interests? Or maybe is it polling data that shows that a more hawkish stance on trade with China would result in more votes? Or even maybe most cynically, are these changes actually made to protect the investments of multinational corporations? BlackRock, which is one of the world's largest global financial asset management firms, has on their website information about their thoughts on investments in different green technologies. They talk about some of the benefits of actually investing in these sectors. And one of the highlighted points here is this policy sector where they say, hey, maybe it makes sense to invest here because there's $470 billion committed in the US to transition funding, and as well as 635 billion euros in the EU. And over the past 4 years, Canada definitely has not been left out of this picture. This is a report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, a nonpartisan part of the government, or a part of the sort of political establishment that will do reports here to get unbiased information on where the government's money is going. And in this report, they outlined the whopping $52 billion over the past 4 years that has been committed to this kind of investment, specifically investments that have been given either dollars or in tax write-offs for global multinational corporations, all who are coming to Canada to do some sort of EV supply chain manufacturing. The government will claim that these companies are coming here because everyone wants to invest in Canada, but some people who are more skeptical might say, well, they're coming here because of the $52 billion that we're giving them. With the green transition being such a heavy focus in most countries across the world, well, it has all of those same countries saying, I really want a piece of that pie. I want to make sure that our country's included in that EV supply chain so that we can provide better jobs for our citizens and so that we can be part of the new world economy. Now, the problem is, it's not just the West that has that goal. China also has the same goal, and by many accounts, they're doing a better job, at least when you look at things like this.
The Chinese automaker logged 2.4 million new car insurance registrations in 2023, making it the top brand in China with a market share of 11%.
I don't think anywhere in the history of the automobile has any company enjoyed such explosive growth in such a short period of time.
BYD has grown into this powerhouse. You look at the monthly rankings, they're always at the top.
In 2023, BYD produced more than 3 million new energy vehicles, which include plug-in hybrids and battery electrics, surpassing Tesla's production of 1.84 million cars.
BYD is so much ahead of Tesla in China, it's almost ridiculous.
BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams, is the fastest growing auto manufacturer worldwide. It's based out of China. The company started as a battery manufacturer, supplying many early cell phones, but now they're taking major market share of the EV industry worldwide. Prior to these tariff announcements, well, they were heavily exploring entering these North American markets, entering Canada and the United States, and competing with all of these legacy automakers, and competing with these automakers who are now starting to manufacture a little bit more in North America. This is one of the main concerns that Freeland and Joe Biden were talking about in the clips in the article that we looked at, is this worry that, okay, if this automaker comes in and has this incredible capacity to manufacture vehicles and they're shipping them into our markets, well, then that will be a race to the bottom. We'll have such a supply that consumers will not have to pay a lot for these cars, but also our own companies that we've invested $52 billion in and even more in the States, well, these automakers won't be able to make as much of a profit. They also argue that the only reason that BYD is able to achieve such growth and achieve such supply output is, well, they're heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. The Chinese government is trying to make this a successful business, right? Now, there's two different ways of framing this. Freeland says this is a direct attack against Canada and the West, trying to undermine our industries and to make it so that they cannot be profitable. Those industries collapse, and then China is the only supplier. But the other way to frame it is perhaps China is not all that different from us here in Canada and in the US, where they're trying to take as much share of a industry as possible, setting themselves up for a future that they see coming. Is this a direct attack, or is this just another nation state acting in their best interest instead of in the interest of other Western countries? And our governments will say, well, it's a good thing that we are putting these tariffs on these cars, and it's a good thing that we are making such massive investments in these domestically produced but maybe not domestically owned companies. We need to make sure that there's jobs and manufacturing happening in our countries. They say these massive investments are made in the EV industry to chiefly provide jobs for citizens, good paying manufacturing jobs that will result in better pay for workers and will decrease our overall reliance on foreign markets and supply chains that could, one day become compromised if geopolitical situations change and tensions ever rise. And that could very well be true. This could be a good thing. But at the same time, these types of protectionist policies will definitely have an impact on how much Canadians and Americans pay. Finance Minister Freeland and Prime Minister Trudeau, their primary criticism is that China is oversupplying markets with EVs, and as a result, creating a race to the bottom in terms of the prices for these vehicles. But it is a delicate balance. Yes, increasing our manufacturing capacity, it has a lot of benefits, but it also exposes consumers to higher prices, as companies who manufacture things in North America often will have higher production costs due to labor costs and the other regulations that we've talked about. The reality is this is going to end up hitting Canadians in the pocket, and it wouldn't be too much of a concern for me if governments weren't setting such aggressive targets for transitioning away from non-electric vehicles, essentially forcing Canadians to move in the EV direction. Take a look at this. I found it really interesting. If you're Canadian or American, you've probably heard of these phase-out targets for gasoline-powered vehicles saying, hey, we're only going to sell new electric vehicles as of a given year, and after that, well, gas vehicles will be a thing of the past. Internal combustion engine vehicles will be gone, and these targets are pretty aggressive. Canada's got 2035, so does California, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington, as well as essentially the entire European Economic Area in the UK, and Singapore, Chile, and Cape Verde. These targets have the intent of saving the environment and preventing climate change, which could be true, but they're also essentially saying, hey, we're going to limit your options, and instead of allowing you to choose between, for example, let's say, allowing you to choose between apples and avocados, instead we're only going to allow you to buy avocados, which actually happen to be more expensive than the apples we let you buy in the past. Oh, and by the way, since we've invested so heavily in increasing our ability to grow avocados, we're going to make sure that you can only buy the avocados that we grow, or if you want those other avocados from another country, you're going to have to pay a hefty premium. That way, we can keep avocado prices high and make sure we didn't waste all our money by investing in all of those extremely expensive avocado farms, which may or may not be owned by Canadian and American corporations. Maybe they're owned by corporations from other countries. From a national overall perspective, I think it makes sense on some levels. Like if our governments have invested tens of billions of dollars, then there is a national incentive to make sure that these investments pay off to some extent at least. But if we don't see the actual growth that they're saying we'll see as a result of welcoming this manufacturing, and if we don't see a growth in wages to offset these new rules and the higher prices that could result from them, well, then you gotta ask yourself, was the juice even really worth the squeeze? But I will tell you one thing, whether it pans out for these nations, or even if it's not so successful and the industry doesn't grow how they'd hope, it's these giant multinational corporations who have received billions in handouts and tax incentives that win regardless of what happens in the future. And that's part of what makes me wonder if these decisions are being made with honest intent to do the best thing for citizens to increase their quality of life, or are these decisions and the sort of flipping of perspectives here just being made as the result of a corporate capture of our government policies? It's exactly that kind of concern about corporate manipulation that makes people skeptical of any cause that a government is going to throw hundreds of billions of dollars at. I think there's a lot of benefits to financial elite as a result of the heavily emphasized green technology narratives. Like, let me present a pretty profitable path for you, and I'll see what you think about this. Like, if you were a big company or a big investment firm, first invest tons of venture capital money to start up green businesses and gobble up more ownership of companies who could stand to benefit from potential government subsidies in this sector. Then you could shift public opinion via a corporately owned and captured media that the perception is that the most existential threat in the world is climate change. Get people really riled up about that. Make them more worried than they need to be about this, possibly, right? Now, if you say that that's the most existential threat in the world, then governments can then pass off massive investments in these same companies as rational, because if the world's going to end, then no amount of investment is too much. Now, simultaneously, these same governments would then be turning their backs to industries that they could already have a competitive advantage in because they don't pass the newly formed green purity test. Now, if I were more cynical, I may start to believe that a lot of this change has stemmed from a class of financial elite that could really stand to benefit from everything that's happening here. To be honest with you, I really don't know. Like, I think that climate change is real, and I deeply care about the environment, the trees, the animals, and the almost sort of spiritual feeling that nature can give us. Not to mention the health benefits of spending time in nature, both physical and mental, right? But I do have a hard time trusting a lot of the alarming reporting and narratives that have been put out there, because to be honest with you, I have a hard time knowing which articles and videos that I watch are true and which ones are clearly meant to make me think a certain way for somebody else's benefit. Like, even all of the articles and videos that I've shared with you today, they all have their own slant, right? Like, we know that, and they all shape the way that we look at things. And it's really hard to sort of figure out, well, who's telling me the truth and who's not. In making these videos, I just hope that I can document my own personal attempt to sort of parse apart and sort through all of this stuff so that you can compare it against your own attempts to do the same thing. And then maybe we can work together and make some sense of it collectively. As for these trade actions, these acts of economic war, essentially, well, obviously China's not happy about it. This is from the Chinese state media saying that Canada is being manipulated by America's unhealthy policies, which could potentially lead to more barriers to free market circulation and as a result negatively impact Canada's domestic economy. And many experts think that China is probably going to retaliate in some way against this action. And we can sort of look to see what they did with the European Union, who similarly added tariffs on Chinese EV imports up to 36.3%. Canada has proposed 100% here. They go on to say that at least in the EU, as soon as these tariffs hit, China then said, well, hey, let's look at some of your sort of sketchy propped up industries in your country's EU, and maybe let's close off your ability to access the Chinese market, which could hurt your companies. This is something that we could see similarly happen in Canada if we're to go through with these kinds of actions. Well, obviously, any state is going to act in their own best interests. Is Canada doing that for its citizens? Is China doing that for theirs? It's hard to know. But one thing I know is that it's going to be interesting to watch how this all plays out. And I'm curious what you think of everything that we've talked about here today. Is this really an attack on America and Canada, as the governments are saying, like a dramatic oversupply to try to attack Canadian and American industry? Or is this a state acting rationally, supporting its domestic industrial growth, just as we are attempting to do with our billions of dollars of investment domestically? Like, how do you see things? Let me know down in the comments. I really am curious to what you have to say down there. If you want the sources that I've used in this video, you can sign up for the email newsletter that goes out after every video. It has all the sources that I use for every single video, so you can check that out there. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I greatly appreciate that. And with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really hope this video has helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.